Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Salam alaikum, welcome. I'm Sharon Ward, Chief Executive at Refugees as Survivors. Affectionately, we're known as RAS, Primary Mental Health and Wellbeing Service for refugee background people in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So thank you for joining us today for what I hope will be a therapeutic opportunity for us to talk about how we can best support our Afghan whānau and each other through this international crisis. In just one single day, President Ashraf Ghani fled Kabul. The government of Afghanistan collapsed and the American embassy was abandoned in total panic. When the Taliban entered Kabul and seized power on the 15th of August, even they were surprised at the rapid speed of their takeover. This just the latest traumatic chapter in the modern history of Afghanistan, a story littered with bitter conflict, where many Afghans have never known a life lived without foreign invasion, civil war, or insurgency. And that seems extraordinary. Over the past months, RAS has received many requests from individuals, communities, and service providers for information on how best to support Afghan families. In this session, we will investigate the psychological impact and how we can help. Joining us today are clinical psychologists Frozan Esmati and Shirley Richards, both experts in trauma-informed clinical practice with years of experience working with refugee background communities in a cultural context. So, without further ado, I will now hand over to our host for today's session, Sarah Macdonald.
Thank you, Sharon. Kia ora koutou and salam alaikum. It's a great pleasure to be able to offer this webinar for all of you who are walking alongside whānau from Afghanistan during this challenging time. First, we're going to start today with Karakia. This is to open our session, to lay the foundation of unity and to honor those who have come before us. Then I'll go through a few things to keep in mind during the webinar, and then I will further introduce Frozan and Shirley, and they will take you through the rest of our webinar. Tutawa mai runga, tutawa mai raro, tutawa mai roto, tutawa mai waho. Kia tō ai te mauri tū, te mauri ora, ke te katoa, huie, humie, tai kie. Come forth from above, below, within, and from the environment. Vitality and well-being for all, strength and unity. Okay. So things to keep in mind today during our webinar. Our focus today is mental health and how we can support refugee background whānau when crisis hits back home, particularly today in Afghanistan. We're not able to give any kind of immigration advice. However, there will be links regarding that in the handbook that will be sent out after this webinar. There will be a Q&A that is live throughout the webinar, and we're hoping to be able to weave your questions into our kōrero. If for any reason we aren't able to answer those questions, please feel free to contact us after the webinar and we will do our best to answer. And also, when you are writing in the Q&A, please be mindful of keeping privacy. If you are talking about a specific scenario that you may be facing with whānau, it's really important to keep people's privacy safe in an environment such as this one. And as I said before, there will be a handbook that will be distributed with an overview of today's webinar, but also of a registry of community organizations and also supports for whānau from refugee backgrounds, in particular with the Afghan crisis, and they are resources throughout the motu, throughout New Zealand. So with further ado, I'm going to introduce our psychologist today who will be presenting. First of all, Frozan Esmati is a registered clinical psychologist and supervisor with 10 years of clinical experience in trauma. She has a private practice in Auckland, providing psychological assessment and interventions to clients who have experienced trauma. She is also a consultant with the World Bank Group and provides counseling services to World Bank offices in East Asia and the Pacific region. Frozan was born in Afghanistan and has worked with the United Nations in Afghanistan for 4 years. She has also completed her master's degree with her research in PTSD and depression among post-Afghan women, where she interviewed 216 women in Kabul. Frozan has also worked for RAS in the past and for a period of 3.5 years, providing an evidence-based treatment for clients from refugee backgrounds. It's wonderful to have you here, Frozan. Thank you so much for joining us. Shirley Richards. Shirley is a qualified former psychologist and teacher currently contracted with RAS as part of our research and training team and also as a supervisor to our cultural facilitators. For over 20 years, she has worked with YouthLink Family Trust and the Ministry of Education and RAS as a psychologist, service manager, and clinical team leader. The wide-ranging and in-depth postgraduate training that has led her into the psychological field of crisis intervention, challenging behavior, and trauma. During the Christchurch earthquakes, she was the coordinator of our RAS psychological response team, and this team worked conjointly with the police to support bereaved and trauma-affected families. In her private practice, her psychological focus was with young people under the care of Oranga Tamariki and youth justice services. Over the years, she was fortunate to take up a contract in London and Singapore, where her psychological practice supported diverse communities. Shirley's interest in working alongside refugee communities started a long time ago when she volunteered at the Tibetan refugee community in Dharamsala in India. Once back in New Zealand, she became the coordinator for the Kosovo project and the multi-agency on the TRACK program for refugee youth and whānau. Shirley has engaged with volunteer positions in Ethiopia, India, and Vanuatu. So you're all in fantastic hands today. And I'm going to pass over to Shirley and Frozan, and we will start our slides as well. And I will share my screen here so that you can see the slides. There we go.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for the introduction. I would like to thank RAS for creating this opportunity for all of us to have this space to discuss mental health of Afghans. Assalamu alaikum and Kia everyone. Thank you for joining. Thank you for our compassionate Kiwis who had shown interest, and you have made the time on a Saturday noon to attend this session to learn more about how you can support the Afghan community. And I would also thank our Afghans from our Afghan community who have joined this session today. The past few weeks have been extremely hard, but I hope you will benefit from the content of this presentation. Sarah, if you don't mind, if you can go to next slide, please. So before we go to on practical tips on how to help Afghans, I would like to give a bit of background about Afghanistan, about the Afghanistan as a country, and also would like to give a bit of background about the current mental health situations there and available data. So Afghanistan is a landlocked country at the crossroad of Central and South Asia. It is bordered by Pakistan to the east and south, Iran to the west, Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan to the north, and Tajikistan and China to the northwest. The place that I come originally from is Badakhshan. It's bordered with China and Tajikistan. We have beautiful mountains, but not much water, unfortunately. Afghanistan has a population of 38 million. Islam is the religion, and we have both Sunni and Shia Muslims. 90 9.7 population or Muslim languages or Dari and Pashto, and we have also small minority who speak Uzbek. Literacy rate, that's for people who have received formal education, is low compared to many countries. According to a data in 2016, only 34% of the population, had received formal education. That eventually increased in recent years to 43, and the literacy rate for the youth was reported to be 65%. That's for youth aged between 15 to 24. The literacy rate among women is much lower than men. Only 29% of Afghan women have received formal education compared to 55% of men. And that's because of different factors, the socioeconomic factors, security situations, social and cultural barriers that has stopped Afghans to have access to formal educations. Most Afghans live in rural areas, and almost 3 million of the population have lived in Kabul, which is the capital. On the family dynamics, so for Afghans, family is the single most important aspect of their lives. Afghan culture is very collectivistic, and usually people generally put their family's interests before their own. That's why some of you who have worked with the Afghan community, you may have heard a lot of anxieties and worries about their family members back home. In the traditional Afghan culture, family matters are usually kept strictly private. People are often reluctant to share personal issues with non-family members, as community knowledge of a family's struggle can bring shame on the household. Women may be slightly more likely to open up to other women, but usually family matters are kept within the family. The Afghan households are generally large and multi-generational, so usually, grandparents, in-laws, children, and parents have lived in the same household. There are exceptions with, with education, with improvement of socioeconomic status. We have families who separated and lived individually, but that's for the majority. And according to a data in 2010, the average size of a household in Afghanistan was reported to be 7.8 people. So family roles vary between ethnicities, socioeconomic status, and regions, but nevertheless, a more traditional patriarchal age hierarchy prevails throughout all. The eldest male usually has the most authority and decision-making, and female and male roles are quite traditional. Males are expected to be the breadwinner of the family, and women are expected to engage in domestic chores, cooking, raising children. Separation of genders in most Afghan public settings, and that resonates with the Afghan community here. Most of the gatherings, whether it's Eid gathering or a wedding party, birthday party, women and men are separate. They celebrate it, but in separate kind of halls and rooms. Polygamy is legal and divorce is rare and it's stigmatized in Afghanistan. Couples that seek to end their marriage usually face huge pressure from family and society to reunite. So that's a bit of about the country. I know when we say Afghanistan, the first thing that comes to many of our minds is war. But below that layer, Afghanistan has rich culture that is characterized by music. We have different types of musics, dance. In any Afghan wedding and gathering, if you go, regardless of how conservative the family is, there is music and dance. men and women are separate, but that's how traditionally celebrations are celebrated. We have art, drawings. Many of these paintings that you see behind me they have all came from Afghanistan. And food is a great way that we connect, and Afghans, we take a lot of pride in our food. The reason I'm mentioning this is it's important to be aware of these resources that your Afghan clients have underneath their sleeves. Without boring you with history lesson, let's just go a little bit about history of war. This year I turned 40, and I don't remember any time in my life that Afghanistan was without war. So the war started prior to when I was born. So that's 1978, 1979, and until now. That's more than 40 years of war. We had civil war, the Taliban invasion, the Mujahideen, and then the US-led government. What all these wars and different governments meant for the people of Afghanistan was trauma, loss of family members, loss of households, exposure to violence, having sustaining injuries, and displacement, internal displacements, and migration to other countries. When I did my own master's thesis with the population of women, almost all of them reported that they have lost 1 to 2 family members throughout a war. So one can imagine the psychological presentations of the population given the duration that they have been exposed to violence and war. There is not much available data on mental health of Afghans, but there are a few researches that I would like to kind of touch upon. So there were 2 researches in 2002 and 2003. They assessed the prevalence of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, and in one of them took samples from all around Afghanistan. What they found was interesting, that PTSD symptoms was not as high as expected, meaning not as high as they were expecting a post-conflict country or a country in conflict to have. There were, of course, methodological issues with those researches that I don't want to get into in this space. But 2 reasons came up, and that Afghans are quite resilient. Their strong faith in religion and in God is a protective factor. It's not the Taliban that came and taught Afghans about Islam. Afghans were Muslim for thousands of years. So that had been a strong protection for them, as well as the strong social connection. But symptoms of depression and anxiety were quite high, around 60%. Women, throughout all the studies that were conducted in Afghanistan, showed higher prevalence of mental health disorders compared to men. And one of the theories is, of course, women went through more difficult time during the Taliban's first invasion, where they were banned from education and employment. But also there is a theory that Afghan women are more willing to seek help and present their struggles. A survey by the European Commission in 2018 found that 85% of Afghans had witnessed at least one traumatic event. So it is, when we say that prevalence of PTSD is low, it doesn't mean that Afghans have not been impacted. I think the emotional regulation have definitely been impacted. There is lots of impulsivity, anger management that manifests in relationships at home, with partners, with kids, with the community in large. The availability and accessibility to mental health services in Afghanistan is very limited. There are not many trained mental health professionals in the country. A few years back, the WHO report, the World Health Organization released a report that there were only 2 psychiatrists in the country, and none of them were living in the country. Afghanistan government, along with international organizations, they try to meet the mental health need of people by training doctors in mental health, by training what they call it psychosocial counselors, short-term training, but that was not sufficient. And then also there is a bit of stigma attached to understanding of mental health and receiving mental health support among Afghan community that might manifest when they come here. In Afghan community, sometimes there are lots of jokes about mental health that you really need to be crazy for you to go to a psychologist or a psychiatrist, or some people even they do not know the difference between, who is a psychologist, who is a counselor, who is a psychiatrist, because these services were not available. We will touch base on them. Next slide, please, Sarah. Shirley, I think I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you very much, Frozan. Kia ora koutou katoa, assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Raz, for the opportunity to take part in this webinar, and welcome and thank you for those that are joining the webinar today. And obviously you have a genuine interest to bring support to Afghan whānau, and welcome also to our Afghan whānau who are with us today as well. Thanks again, Frozan, for sharing this complex history and existing contexts in which Afghanistan is embroiled. You've outlined for us a vivid picture, long-standing trauma, and it's hard to get that picture out of your head. Today, with immediate worldwide broadcasting, we're all instantly exposed to confronting ongoing trauma and the events that have been occurring in Afghanistan. We know that people are impacted around the world. And we also know that here in New Zealand, our Afghan neighbours, professional contacts, friends, colleagues, classmates, students, and young children are affected. It's a natural, and what are some of the common feelings and behaviours? I'm going to go on and talk about that, and Frozan and I are going to talk together about this, so that you can be aware that these are some common feelings and behaviours. They are natural or normal responses that people might display. Disbelief, for example, shock, irritability or agitated behaviours can be expressed, or even held within themselves, within people's selves. Sadness and despair for what is to come is very prevalent. The intensity and the frequency of the stress may depend on different factors, and I really want to make it stress that each person's response will be unique and each family's response will be unique. So what are some of the factors that we need to consider that are involved in these behaviours? Why should these behaviours be surfacing? Well, we know very well that the triggers from the past trauma, which Frozan has talked about, can be intense and very, very frightening. Hypervigilance, flashbacks, nightmares, fears and anxiety about the future may surface. It's obvious that there'll be intense loss and grief for families left in Afghanistan or other parts of the world. Survivor guilt and feeling powerless can be heightened. People questioning themselves about what more could they have done for their families and others. Shame even that they couldn't help themselves, let alone their loved ones and their children. And as Frozan said, it's always important to acknowledge the resilience that people display and the coping strategies they've used through the times of displacement from their own home and resettlement. That's men, women, and children. The resilience factors and protective factors are personal and unique to the individuals and the family circumstances, and they can sustain coping strategies. Some common responses you might see or you might feel: the difficulty making decisions, concentrating, focusing on things that you used to enjoy, memory loss. Some people may observe these difficulties in families, or people like teachers or support people often say, they were able to do that yesterday, but not since. And loved ones may be concerned about the fact that the forgotten conversations or regular activities are forgotten. Parents may be distracted and disoriented from routines, and children and young people in the family may feel isolated from usual family interactions. We've had some questions about this, and people wonder how they can support people who have been so distracted and disorientated that they maybe have neglected their children in some ways, or the young people have not had the responses that they used to, because after all, parents love their children so much and they want them to do the very best. And if you as a supporter or a person who understands the situation, it might be difficult for you to find a way to support the family. And maybe you can help the parents to engage with the children again in favourite family activities and help them plan for future activities. And we know that, for example, that cooking is always popular, and reading is nurturing, and of course art can be therapeutic. We also know that children may not express their feelings easily, but taking time to listen to any conversation they offer is important. In some ways, children can be our guides. Behavioural changes such as irritability and anger and floods of tears may present. I'm sure we've all seen this, and in ourselves during traumatic times. This behaviour may be out of character for an individual, but surface during these very tough times. Some people might say but it happened from nowhere. But that is not the case, because we know that behaviour changes are always a message of need. We've had some questions about intergenerational perspectives and the conflict and disputes and unwanted behaviours that might bring into a family situation. And Frozan, you might talk some more about this, but let's not pretend that this is easy to manage, especially when people are triggered with resurfacing trauma effects. We would like to build and suggest that building tolerance for different views, like agree to disagree, is something that might be obtainable. What do you think about that, Frozan?
Yeah, thank you, Shirley. I think in the past few weeks, a few things that have came up from family, from the community, from the clients that I'm working, Afghan clients. One is that sense of helplessness. I can't do anything for my family back home, or I can't do anything for the woman or for the country. And there is a lot of sadness. I've heard lots of cryings and anger and irritability that can manifest in your relationships. I see lots of angry posts on Facebook, lots of conflicts about different political fights and arguments. So these are what we call it quite just when Shirley says that these are normal, meaning it's normal given what's happening in the context. It doesn't mean that you're not suffering. It is difficult. People have found it really hard to make decisions, to even concentrate and to be able to do their jobs in whatever job sector that they are at. If you notice, the symptoms usually start to become less and less over time, but we will talk about it that for some, it just stays there or it becomes worse. One of, somebody from the community told me that she said, as she was dressing in Auckland, she was dressing, suddenly she was like, oh my God, what should I wear to be safe outside because Taliban are there? And another one said that as he woke up, he felt that, Taliban are outside. So a lot of, re-traumatization from the past can happen, a lot of disorientation, dissociation that might take place. So if you are an Afghan listening to this and you have experienced some of this, or you're experiencing some of these symptoms, tell yourself that given what's happening, it is normal. I'm not getting crazy. I'm not, just because you're having this, it does not mean that you're having a significant mental health disorder. And for those of our participants who are working with Afghan clients, students, just remind them that these are normal responses. I know as a helper, sometimes we can become very anxious and we want to just throw skills and solutions to solve the problem, but just a bit of reassurance at this stage can go a long way. Sarah, if you can go to the next slide, just reiterating what Shirley and I were talking about. Next one, please.
Frozan, before we go to this slide, I just want to touch also on changing of eating patterns that might happen, and also loss of sleep. So these are also issues that might surface and people be concerned about. And one woman that I heard just last week saying you know, in terms of her sleep, that although she was physically here, she wasn't mentally here, and she'd wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and think over and over again, what have I done? Have I done the right thing? What can I do now? So these are also issues that have been surfacing, and we'll go on now and talk about how can we support whānau.
Thank you, Shirley. Absolutely. About eating, you know, some people might overeat as a way to cope you know, with these difficult emotions, and we can have another category who will refrain from eating. You will notice that you don't have any appetite, and you miss breakfast, you miss lunch, you miss dinner. So just ask yourself how you're doing in terms of sleep and your eating, that we will touch base again in the coming slides. So now the question comes, how can we support our Afghan whānau? But with this, I think first thing is build trust and rapport, and ensure safety. That's what, you know, it is basic knowledge from safe trauma practice. How do you do that? Giving information. First of all, introducing yourself well, introduce your roles. Don't be surprised that if an Afghan client walks in your door, if you're a psychologist or a counselor, they might be confused. What's your role? Why are you asking them about their sleep and their eating, or how many kids they have? So explain your role. Explain about confidentiality, reassure them, equip them with their rights, you know, basic patients' rights that we have in New Zealand. It's important to go through them so they feel empowered. If they don't like to talk to you, that's their choice. They can let you know that I prefer to see another clinician. I think all of these bring a sense of safety. And then you might hear questions about immigration, about housing, questions about basic kind of needs that give them sense of safety. I understand that not all our roles are there to, you know, provide the answers, but the resources that Sarah was talking about would be really helpful. You can direct them to other organizations, saying, you know, let me call, you know, look at Red Cross. Red Cross Employment Support, for example, can support you, and I can give them a ring, or, you know, this is the contact number. That would really help to build that trust. And once you have that, then it provides a safe context for you to work on some of the anxiety and the skills that you want to give them.
Yes, because building the trust and rapport actually is the -- stance for educators, health professionals, support people, because the Afghan people haven't had the opportunity to live in a trusting society. Many of them may have a great deal of difficulty developing trust with others, particularly those that are unknown or authoritarian figures. And which conversation do they bring out for which person? They've had so many conversations with so many different people. And where does that information go? So I've actually always felt humbled by the trust that people have given me when they spend time with me, let alone, you know, the usual conversations. Everyday conversations are fine, and that's a great place to build trust, let alone the stories and the struggles and the challenges. So just spend time with everyday activities, conversations, interests, fun, food, crafts. That sort of thing is a really important start.
Shirley, if I can interrupt on the issue of building rapport and creating a safe space, sometimes there is a risk that you know, your Afghan client might overshare and might feel obliged to tell you all the horrible experiences that he or she has gone through in one sessions. So I think, you know, a bit of psychoeducation about trauma and the risk of re-traumatization would be helpful, and reassuring them that, you know, there is no obligation that you need to tell you everything, because that can really create, you know, clinically, we all know that risk of re-traumatization when that safety is not there.
Yeah. So listening, active listening is important. Listening with our ears and our heart. And you've all heard about using an empathetic approach, stepping into somebody else's shoes. But I advocate that you step into your own shoes first. Just check your own biases, your role, confidentiality issues, and vulnerabilities, as Frozan's mentioned. Then step into the other person's shoes and metaphorically lean in and listen, validating emotions and recognizing that the people that you are speaking to have amazing inner resources and resiliency. You don't have to come up with a pile of answers. Listening is the most important thing you can do. I like there's a little saying that I use, and it's like, sprint forward with compassion and walk towards advice. You might think, I don't know what to say. I don't know how to begin. But remember, we all have the skills for communication. It's a universal connection, even if you don't even speak the same language. So even if you have a tragic event being talked about in front of you, remember that the best thing you can do, the most important part of the conversation, is listening. Interestingly, I've talked with people who've been in with the RAS service years ago, and they say to me, I can't remember what the person said, but I remember their smile, I remember their face, and I remember the feeling of being listened to. Some people have talked about a worry around the pressure. What should they do if people bring out these their stories, their tragic stories of struggle, because it's a heartfelt environment that you're working in at that time. But I'd say to you, you know, the important part of the conversation is your attendance at that conversation. But please also contact your supervisor and manager if it's causing you stress, and debrief. Debrief is recommended, and of course generate and activate your own self. Yes.
Thank you, Shirley. I think on the point about validation of emotions, as Shirley mentioned, it's just, I think your listening and validation of emotions can go a long way. But a side note to that, the presentation of mental health symptoms or distress symptoms among Afghans sometimes can vary. What the literature has shown is many Afghans, they can present their psychological distress through somatic complaints. So and even in our language, you know, the words that they use, dalam tangshula, that I feel the tightness in my heart, or the literal definition is jigaram khunas, meaning my liver is full of blood. So those are the explanations that people use to express their distress. And another way that people kind of share their feelings is through poems. We have a quite rich culture of poetry, and we have famous poets. I remember when we were in China, we migrated to China a long time ago in 1992. My father really missed, of course, home and all that. And he was using that poems, you know, he had a few books and he would read a poem and he would shed a few tears, and that was his comfort. So if ask them if, you know, if that's the way for them to express their emotions, then that's also a good way for you to build rapport and initiate that conversation.
And recognize also in terms of physical manifestations that young children, particularly who don't have the words or to express how they're feeling, can present with physical symptoms, rashes, sore tummy, headaches, sore throat, these sorts of things. So be aware that these can also be issues relating to trauma. I think we're going to go on to the next slide. Yeah, some practical reminders about looking after yourself and encouraging others to look after themselves. And we know the mantra around eating healthy, exercise regularly, get plenty of sleep. Can you just talk about alcohol and drugs in terms of Afghan culture, Frozan?
Yeah, thank you. I know it is taboo, and some people might say that, oh, that's not in Afghans don't do that, but unfortunately, it is there, and it is not encouraged by the religion and by the culture, but there is a risk that alcohol can become a coping strategy for some. So if that's the case, I think it's always helpful to ask, so that ensuring that, you know, you're not missing anything. If you're an Afghan listening, and if alcohol has become your way of coping with this, something to, you know, remind yourself and take care of yourself and seek help if needed.
So it says connect here and share your feelings with your friends and family members on the slide. And this is a really important process for taking care of yourself, maintaining your social context and keeping your usual routines, because this can bring stability and equilibrium to the person's day. And connecting with others is really important for emotional health, and because we can feel safer and less isolated and alone. And of course, we know that friendships can bring joy and laughter and positivity, and increase our ideas, bring our children together, and provide company to try new activities, develop new projects. Taking a break is important. I know that we might say, oh, we'll go for a walk in the park, and how hard that might be for people who are affected with trauma symptoms. These are difficult concepts and difficult steps for people to make. But playing games with the family, and bringing forward the activities that you love to do with the families, playing games, board games, throwing a ball around, swimming, making juggling balls. I'm just listing off the things. Dancing and singing, I know, is really important to the Afghan people, as we've heard before. What about playing musical instruments? Getting on with a project around the house, sewing. I know this fine sewing and embroidery that people do, gardening. Family activities can bring a great stress release, because loved ones are close, and this is what we want at times of stress, to bring our loved ones close. And laughter can be loud and even raucous if allowed. And I just like to say, for the people also that are working in the community, debriefing with a supervisor or a senior person in your organization is important. It's important way of ensuring that you have self-care, and of course the usual things like healthy food and physical activity, or other spiritual ways of bringing relief to stressful times. Take a break and delve into preferred activities. Would you like to, Frozan, talk a little bit about the spiritual?
Thank you, Shirley. I think 2 points I want to add on this. One is limiting your exposure to news. I understand, as an Afghan, how much, you can be so tempted to know what's happening back home. And when you're in Afghanistan, you need to know what's happening so that you can plan your safety, you ensure the safety around you. And that's a survival mechanism. But when you're here and you have social media, these phones and all platforms bombarding you with videos of Taliban torturing women, Taliban torturing others, the suicide bombs, the explosions, all of these can really impact your stress response. If we use the analogy of a smoke detector in the brain, the news will just turn on that smoke detector in your brain, and it will be really hard to kind of relax and have a break. So I'm not saying don't listen to the news. Put some boundaries. For example, you can say, I will look at the news from this time to this time, from half an hour, around 10 a.m. and half an hour at 4 p.m. And I can choose what I want to listen. I can choose BBC, for example. I'm just using as an example, and I can look at the headlines, because when you hear the videos, notice yourself, a lot of the news create fear and anxiety. So, control. Say, I think I can see in Instagram and Facebook, you can have those options of, I want to see less of this, or I want to block this. That's for your well-being. So once putting some boundaries with the news and media, the other one is putting some boundaries in the volume of calls that you're engaged with people back home. Social connections are important, and we really encourage you to call each other, especially nowadays that in Auckland, in New Zealand, we are in lockdown.
Yes.
But we need a balance, right? If you find yourself on phone calls with Afghanistan back to back until late at night, then probably think about how you can kind of contain that within some window, with some time frame. And you can let your family know that, for example, I'm available from 7 p.m. to 8:30 for a phone call, and after that I'm busy. Shirley talked about sleep difficulties that happen, that can happen during this time. And one of the ways that you can help with your sleep is putting these boundaries, making sure you do something relaxing instead of watching those videos or listening to distressing stories from back home, so that you can sleep better. Remember, I know as if you're an Afghan here, you feel guilt. There is that kind of sense of guilt that if I don't answer calls, I'm being selfish. But if you take care of yourself, that analogy of oxygen to the mother first, then to the child. If you take care of yourself better, you will be in a better position to support your family members over long period of time. Thank you.
I think we're coming to the last slide now.
Yeah. And then the question comes, so when can I seek help? Or if you're a helper already, if you're a teacher, a counselor, a GP, when can I refer on? It is difficult. Every case is different, but I'm asking about the sleep, the nightmares, flashbacks. Again, nightmares, you can have 1 or 2 nightmares and you can be able to function. But if you have nightmares every night and your ability to function at home with your partner, with your kids, at the job that you're doing is impacted, you're not able to function in those areas, then it's important to take help.
I think the important point there is how it affects your functioning.
Yes, yes,
Your
yes,
relationships. Your
yes,
yes.
yeah. I received a few kind of calls lately. Someone said that I just can't stop thinking about Afghanistan, and I cannot disconnect my thoughts. No matter what I do, my mind is there. I'm constantly by my phone. If somebody, if I call a family member and they don't answer, then I go into those catastrophic thinking that something horrible must have happened, and I cannot engage with my children here and with my job here. Then in those, if that's your condition, or if that's the condition of a person that you're working with, refer them. And one of the best ways that you can do is ask them to talk to their GP. Sarah is also going to, I think in her resource book, provide a list of available resources. So there are a few places that people can go to, but sometimes starting with your GP might be the easiest way.
And I agree, the GP is the first point of call, and nowadays you can just ring up the reception and get to speak to the nurse, and they will put you in touch with the doctor by the phone, as in the first instance, which makes it easier, an easier conversation, and there can be interpreters provided. As well as that, I think they have now health improvement practitioners, which are available free. You can go on and see. But there's one thing that I really advocate, and that is for managing difficult times, put the emergency numbers near where you live, in a place where everybody can see, and your family members, so that you're prepared in case of emergencies.
Yeah. And just a message to our resilient, wonderful Afghan participants who are listening to this webinar. If you seek help, if you go to your GP, or if you go to a psychologist or counselor, remember that all those conversations are confidential. Nobody will share those information without your permission, except when you're really unwell and you're at risk. Even then it's shared with places that will help you further. It does not impact your status with WINS. It does not impact your employment. And the fact that you reach for help is a sign of your resiliency, a sign of your strength, that you have identified the difficulties that you're struggling with, and you have the courage to take help. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for joining the webinar. We're very pleased to have your presence here today. Sarah.
Kia ora koutou. So thank you so much, Shirley and Frozan, for today. There are so many questions coming through. We hope that many of those questions will be answered with the handbook. If you still have some other questions that aren't covered in that handbook that will be sent to you through email, please feel free to contact us. This has been recorded, this webinar, and so that will be on our YouTube account, and you'll be able to find links on that on our website and on our social media. And please feel free to share. This is an open source, and use it for whatever you feel it could be helpful for, and to whom you think it would be helpful for. So that's us for today. I hope that there's sunshine where you are, and just stay safe out there, everyone. Thanks so much, Shirley, Frozan, Sharon.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.